So over the course of the next hour or so, we have three fantastic IAA-funded projects to spotlight and share with you all. So the three projects are on a really diverse range of topics. So I'll give you a little introduction for each, and then obviously the presenters will share their own experiences later on. So the first project is titled Autism in the Air, and that will be presented by Dr. Nichola Booth from Queen's University Belfast. This project is titled Try Before You Fly, and its initiative was aimed at children with autism and their families, with the goal of trying to alleviate anxiety for first-time flyers. The second project will be co-presented by Dr. Jess Kingston and Chris Taylor, who are collaborating on a project funded by Royal Holloway, the University of London. In this project, Jess was awarded IAA funding for a placement that took part in the NHS, where she worked with young people, healthcare professionals, and school staff. The aim of that work was to gather insights which would inform the most profitable future direction for understanding and treating paranoia in adolescents. And then the third and by no means least project will be presented by Dr. Margaret Vogelzang from Newcastle University. The aim of this pilot was to raise awareness of multilingual and cultural factors in autism diagnoses. And the goal of this project was to engage with clinicians and speech and language therapists, the general population, and also people with autism, in the hope that this increased awareness might lead to more accurate assessments. So before we sort of deep dive into each of these projects, I'd like to provide a quick introduction for myself and introduce our guest speaker, Alice, who will kick things off for us today. So my name is Rachel. I'm the Impact and Partnerships Manager at Royal Holloway, University of London. I've been managing our IAA for the last year and a half or so. And through this programme, I've been able to support a huge range of impacts projects at our university. And it's been great to see such positive impact developed off the back of our social science research. Just a quick note as well, I'm always open to learning new things, creating new connections. So if anybody wants to get in touch to discuss collaboration or to share ideas about management of IAAs, please do feel free to get in touch and I'll pop my email in the chat. So, as you've probably already worked out, I will be your chair today. I'll be trying to make sure things run on time and ensure everyone with questions gets the chance to raise them. We'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end, so please save these until we get to the end of all three presentations. So before I hand over to Alice, just some quick notes about housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded. The recording will be saved and hosted on the UKRI YouTube channel. Please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. You can use the raise your hand function at the bottom toolbar or use the chat to ask any questions. And my colleague Ellie will be monitoring the chat and sort of giving you the chance to raise those questions in live time as well. I'd also like to provide a gentle reminder to our speakers about timekeeping. We have allocated 10 minutes per presentation, so Ellie will again prompt you with a 1-minute warning if it looks like things are going to run over. So to kick things off, I'll hand over to Alice, who is the IAA Strategic Engagement Manager for the ESRC, based at the University of Bristol.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am delighted to be here. As Rachel mentioned, I'm the Strategic Engagement Manager for the ESRC Impact Acceleration Accounts, so IAA for short. And the IAAs are strategic awards provided to 32 research organisations across the UK that allow them to respond to impact opportunities in a more flexible, responsive and creative way. These showcases are designed to highlight how ESRC's IAA-funded projects are helping to deliver expertise and impact from world-leading research. So what has been very clear over the past few years is the changing role of social science. So from climate change to public health to digital transformation and inequality, the challenges that we face are increasingly complex and interdisciplinary. Now, none of these challenges are purely technical or scientific by nature. They are all deeply embedded in social, they all have deeply embedded social dimensions. And this is driving a demand for high quality social science evidence. So not just within academia, but across government, industry, society, and communities. Now, the IAAs provide the translational impact infrastructure that enables research to move beyond academia and into real world applications. So in essence, they're catalysts. And they do this by helping to create environments where impact is actively cultivated through relationship building with partners beyond academia. So this type of flexible funding model of the IAAs enables the exchange of knowledge between researchers and non-academic partners in a supported way. So IAAs ensure that the world-leading research doesn't just sit in the journal, that it moves across boundaries, that it connects, and it creates opportunities to improve lives. So these 3 projects that are highlighted today are brilliant examples of the work that researchers and their partners have been doing to improve people's lives. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. And I will now hand back over to the chair. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Alice, for such an insightful introduction into the role of the IAAs. So I will hand over to Dr. Nichola Booth for our first project spotlight.
Very much, Rachel. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about Autism in the Air, Try Before You Fly, and this is a project that I have been working on. We're now in its 11th year of the project, so it's still going strong and there's still great demand for it. So, oh, sorry, next slide, please, Alice. Sorry, thank you. So the overview of the project and how it came about was in my previous role, I worked with a lot of autistic families and their children and young people. And what we found was that the thought of going on holiday was something that wasn't really featuring in many of their lives. It was easier to stay at home rather than face the unpredictability of an airport setting. And the research does show that air travel for an autistic or neurodiverse individual can involve that unpredictability. There's a high sensory load with the noise, lighting, crowds, etc. The rapid transitions between going from security, getting everything off and picking up your belongings at the end of that rollator sort of thing, all of that is in place. And what we were finding was the families were just saying it's not worth it because we don't know how our child is going to react in that environment. We don't know what's going to happen and whether they will cope or get on the plane. We actually did have a family who had a trip booked and all their bags on the plane got through security in the waiting area and their daughter refused to get on the flight. So everything had to be removed, including their baggage and their other children who lost out in their holiday then. So the research does consistently show that anxiety linked to unfamiliar environments can prevent families of autistic children from traveling together. And again, this was a common theme that we were seeing, that maybe one parent would go on holiday and leave the other parent and the autistic child at home and then they swapped and everybody got a holiday, but it was never something that we thought should be happening for family. Everybody should have the right to travel and travel as a family. So we all know that for most people, airport exposure is limited to maybe once per year for maybe the July holiday or August holiday before school starts. So there's not a lot of time to become familiar with that environment, to practice, to become aware of what the expectations are, the rules. And, and again, even put yourself going through an airport, how stressful it can be with the new guidance on security. Do you take your liquids out of the bag? Do you leave them in? The new x-ray machines and things like that there. So it's constantly evolving. And if you're not exposing your child who is neurodiverse to that environment, it can become extremely stressful. And we would maybe see a lot of maybe elopement behavior, maybe aggressive behavior. shutdowns, emotional shutdown that maybe some autistic people engage in. So that there is easier to avoid than to present. So what we decided that we would do with Autism in the Air, the Try Before You Fly program, was that I reached out to our regional airport, Belfast City Airport, and asked if it would be possible to carry out some in vivo events for our families, and they were completely on board. So what we basically do is that we host a number of families who come down to the airport on a Saturday evening. The airport is still working, there's still flights taking off, there's still people arriving. So it's still a busy airport, but not as busy as one of the main airports. And the families, they check in. As you can see in the corner of the screen there, we now, because of the funding that we got, we now have our own logo. So at the check-in desk, families can spot the Autism in the Air logo, so they know that's where they go. They get their sort of fake boarding pass. Then they're brought through security. They're given the opportunity, if they want, for their children to have a search. So in case it does happen, if they're flying for real, they have to go through security as if they were getting a proper flight. So everything, the bags have to go through, iPads have to go through. So even that, for many of my families that I work with, handing over for the children to hand over their iPad to this man or woman at a security and not knowing if they're getting it back, and it goes through this funny machine, even that can help alleviate a lot of concerns for real life. So that's what they do. And we go upstairs, we go through departure lounge, we go through the shop, which is always a minefield because it's glossy, there are toys, there's perfumes, so that overwhelming smell, I come out smelling of like 20 different perfumes, but for many of the families I work with, the children, that smell, that heightened sense of smell is too much for them. And even that can be debilitating and can prevent the actual rest of the flight taking going well. So they have a little bit of time in departure lounge, and then we get on to a grounded aircraft. It is very kindly given to us by Aer Lingus regional airline, Emerald Airlines. And they give us a cabin crew who go through the safety announcements. The kids get to sit in the plane. They get play with seatbelts. They are fascinated by the little menu, and they're ordering everything, which we don't provide, but they do have fun providing it. And picking what they're going to choose. And then they're allowed into the cockpit. The pilot will let them in and get their photograph taken with his hat on and things like that there. That's always a big winner for particularly any of the daddies that attend. They love to get in and sit in the cockpit. So what we also do at the end is every family, every child that attends gets like a goodie bag from the airport, but in it you'll see what we also provide some materials that came about through to the funding of the IAA. In the goodie bag, they'll get a packet of Tato, or National Crisp over here in Northern Ireland. They get juice, chocolate, they get like a sensory toy, and they get the materials that I'm going to show on the next slide, if that's okay, Alice, please. Thank you. So these are the materials that we made for as part of the grant. So part of the funding that we received, we were able to get a designer to design our logo. So you can see it there in all of the materials, the Autism in the Air Try Before You Fly logo. So it features, as I say, we use it for our events, and we use it in any promotional materials, and we use it on our email accounts that we send out to families who are going to take part. So we made a number of different sort of materials. As you can see, there is a tip for parents. There's the Up, Up and Away story, and that's for our readers, or who are sort of children who are able to read. And it's a social story of what to expect for going to the airport. It talks through, it's very animated, it's lovely, and it's very, very simplified. So there are no surprises basically, because unfortunately we can't yet replicate the actual flight. So this is what we're doing in order to get there. And then on the third one there, you can see is our visual social story for a lot of our non-readers who maybe in school, this is the sort of visuals that they use. And these can be printed out and accessed at any time. The airport hosts these on their disability page website. So anybody, even if they're not taking part in the Try Before You Fly scheme, they're able to access these materials, download them and share them. We have had many community groups here in Northern Ireland who have requested these materials. So they put them out with their community groups if they're not able to access a place on the scheme. Next slide, please, Alice. Thank you. So what we have learned is, so basically the materials have been utilised extensively via direct contact with myself or via website download from the George Best Belfast City Airport site. What we did find was that our Try Before You Fly scheme was the first of its kind in Europe. And as a result of sort of things kicking off, we featured on the One Show. They came and did a feature on us. We also had BBC National come, our local BBC programme came and did a news story. Aer Lingus gave us our very first flight a year and a half ago, where we took a flight of young people and their parents up in the air for a 30-minute trial around Belfast. And it was phenomenal. They provided cupcakes for the kids. We had amazing sensory bags, and all of the young people did extremely well. And on the back of that, I received emails, I received cards, I received photographs of many of my young people on their very first ever family holiday. So that there, I think for a lot of the parents who tend to be more nervous than the kids, even that was a success in itself. So what we're now seeing is our local other regional airports. Obviously, airports are very competitive and they all want to do things better than each other. They are now incorporating supports for autistic travelers. Not as good as what we're doing, I'll just give that out there. They're more information seeking and more leaflets providing rather than actual supports. Autism in the Air is now recognised as a brand, and people do talk about autism in the air. And and even in the airport, it's one of their flagship projects that they mention. We have been shortlisted for a Business in the Community Collaboration Award with the airport. We didn't win, but we were shortlisted, so that was a big thing. On the back of it as well, I now have a CAST Studentship Award, where I have a PhD student who is currently working in the airport, and we're working to further develop autism in the air and get more further publications out of it to see what we can do, and can we sort of make and develop like a protocol that can be replicated without the need of behavioral analytic support in other airports, so that they don't need a behavioral analyst there at every event, that it can be run by the airport staff. The Autism in the Air project was also featured as Queen's 180 campaign. So Queen's University is now 180 years old, and it was chosen as one of their flagship projects to show how the impact of our research is working indirectly in the community and with businesses too. And we had the most views ever on the QUB social medias across anything that they've ever done. It's a really highly interesting project, a lot of people interest. However, due to this, it comes swings and roundabouts. The recognition has become quite hard to manage. I have a dedicated email address that I'm the only one who has access to. And as of last week, there were nearly 600 inquiries for the project. It's starting in May again. So I'm trying to sort of prioritize those families who are actually taking a flight soon, and I'm trying to manage that on top of everything else. The airport have provided no support for admin or queries. They just basically, it's our project. Thank you, Ellie. They send it on to me to deal with, and it's expectation, unfortunately, that we will be the on demand for any autism queries that come into the airport. So that's what we're trying to balance at the minute, and I'm trying to work with the airport to take some of that pressure off, because they are benefiting greatly, from hosting the materials that were made at no cost to them. They're they're able to showcase this event at any airport events and things like that there, and it's made them there for their disability access. It's given them their top score over the past number of years as well. So I'm hoping that they'll be willing to listen. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Is it, Alice? Oh, okay. So IAA enabled autism in the air become widely recognized, which is great. But again, when you're only one person doing it, it's hard to manage, but we're getting there. The logo is used in all promotional materials that we've made, including check-in. There are also, as I said earlier, people who can't attend are able to get the access. I'll send them out freely. They can download them if they want. Increase in demand, and as I say, we're getting more publications out of it, and we have a PhD student who's going to further develop the programme, and those materials will be updated. But that logo and all of the initial stuff that we have through the funding has really helped a lot of our families here in Northern Ireland who maybe can't, and even in Southern Ireland, people are accessing this because it's not something that is widely available, these type of supports for the families. So from a little sort of research egg in my head, we have now progressed into this, and we're hoping to build it even further. So thank you very much for having me today. Appreciate it.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing this, Nichola. That sounds like such a lovely project. And it's great to see that you've had such positive support from your local airport. I'm so curious to see how this project evolves as interest in the programme grows. So I'll hand over to Dr. Jess Kingston and Chris Taylor for our second project spotlight.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for that really amazing presentation. It was so great to hear. So I'm going to speak about a knowledge exchange residency, and this was focused on trying to enhance the understanding of paranoia in adolescents. So my name is Jess Kingston. I'm Associate Professor and the Research Director on the Doctoral Clinical Psychology Programme at Royal Holloway, and I'll just let Chris introduce himself too.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Chris Taylor. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist with Pennine Care NHS Foundation Trust, where I worked full time when we had this award, and now still have some links with the trust, but work as a senior lecturer and IHR fellow at the University of Sheffield.
And next slide, please. So I'll start by saying a little bit about paranoia in teenagers. And if you just want to click forward, it will give like a series of, yeah, you can just, that's it. Brilliant. Thank you. So paranoia describes exaggerated fears that other people want to cause you harm. And a lot of my research in the last couple of years has focused on trying to understand this better in adolescents. So we know quite a lot about paranoia in adults, but the key developmental phase where paranoia can start to be quite problematic and escalate is actually adolescence. And there's, relatively speaking, much less research done during this phase of development. And so I've just given like an example of a paranoid worry. So people wanted me to feel threatened, so they stared at me. But there's a whole collection of types of worries that people can have. And what we see is that there's a continuum of experience. So that mild, low-level worries, suspicion, mistrust is like importantly linked to more severe persecutory delusions that we might associate with things like psychosis. There's a full spectrum. And in young people, we find that it can really affect their emotional well-being, their relationships, how they're getting on at school. And that for many young people, especially those who are having a difficult time with their mental health, paranoia is actually often part of the picture, but we don't assess it and we don't tend to identify it in general adolescent mental health contexts. So I guess that's part of the thinking behind this residency. If you just want to click through, there's a couple more just points to come. So my research was focused a lot on trying to understand paranoia during this phase of development, trying to help better detect it and to treat it. And as part of that, I'd started to look more at the role of negative mental imagery, which I guess is a part of, but not the only reason why the collaboration with Pennine Care and with Chris in particular came to be. So I'll let you jump in, Chris.
Thanks, Jess. So some of the work I've been doing in my consultant role was looking at developing new treatments with an imagery focus for people with psychosis and schizophrenia diagnoses. So we know from the literature that up to 74% of people who experience paranoia can also experience intrusive mental images, so pictures in the mind's eye, seeing with the mind's eye, feeling with the mind's sense of touch. And this is particularly important because we know images have a more powerful impact on emotions and how we feel than words or verbal or thoughts alone. And also there's studies that demonstrate that imagery can activate similar areas in the brain to actual perception and experiencing things in day-to-day life. So some of the work that I've been doing in early intervention and in people with longer standing difficulties had been looking at adapting imagery focused therapy approaches to target these concerns and to work with suspiciousness and paranoia. So in bringing our interests together, the idea of the Knowledge Exchange Residency at the Trust was to help lay some important foundations and for Jess and I to think about a roadmap for future priorities in the field. Next slide, please.
And again, you can just go down, yeah, so there's probably 5 maybe points here. So one of the first things we did was to establish a patient public involvement group. So we reached out to young people who had had lived experience of paranoia, and we brought together a group. And really what we wanted to do here is to hold some PPI events to really share knowledge and to understand different perspectives, and critically to think about priorities and what the important directions were from across different stakeholders, and to use that as our one of the key bits to inform our direction of travel, both with this but also thinking more longer term plans. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks. So in working with the young people in our public patient involvement group, after the residency, we developed a new theoretical model of unhelpful, suspicious thoughts in adolescents. So across the literature, most of the existing models that inform the research for people in adults with psychosis and paranoia, all of those models very much come from working with adults and research based with adults. And to date, there's been no model that's looked at the specific things that young people might be experiencing in relation to adolescent paranoia, and things that are important about the developmental stages and the kind of unique things about that time frame for young people.
And so we were really lucky as part of the residency. We had a budget to develop an animation. So it's a very short, sort of 90-second video that just explains paranoia to young people, which we've been getting some feedback on from young people in schools. And we'll share a link through slides shared with you after the talk today. Oh, sorry, back over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jess. So the part of the work that we did in the residency was also thinking about mechanisms that therapeutic interventions could target to help reduce suspicion and mistrust in adolescents. So we put that together into a grant application to the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the NIHR, through their Research for Patient Benefit program, to fund a feasibility randomized controlled trial of offering a suspiciousness and paranoia intervention in a schools-based setting, which we think is one of the first of its kind to try and target working with these difficulties in that particular setting.
And then we've kind of set in motion, I guess, a series of projects with students, and we have now a PhD student as well, where we're looking at many different aspects of adolescent paranoia and of imagery in particular in some of those projects. So we've had a project in CAMS where we're doing a case series of a new therapy for people, young people with elevated paranoia in CAMS, as well as a case series in a school, which has helped to kind of build the foundations for the grant application. And then a 3-year project through a PhD looking much more in detail at the role of imagery in paranoia in this age group. Could we go to the next slide? So in terms of things that worked well, I guess this has been a great springboard in many ways to a fantastic collaboration. And I think, that's been one of the main things perhaps that we've taken away from the residency. And I guess I'm 4 hours away from where the residency was hosted, so it introduced some of its own challenges. But actually, we just met often on, supplemented the residency itself with lots of regular meetings, because I guess what we've discovered is there's so much to do in this area. And in fact, sometimes we feel overwhelmed by how much scope there is of what we could be doing, and just that importance of prioritising and being close to the PPI colleagues who are a part of our grant application as well, in terms of, working out what are the most important things to be tackling and approaching at different points in time. If you just want to go forward on the slides. So I've covered this bit. Prioritising. And I think the protected time for the residency was actually really critical. So I think one of the things it's been really excellent for is having the time as a a very busy consultant clinical psychologist and my academic role on the programme, having that protected time to really prioritise sharing views across stakeholders and thinking about priorities for this field was a really fantastic aspect of the residency. Do you want us to move on to the next slide? And you can just go down for each of these points if that's okay. So I've sort of already covered this bit to some extent. It really supercharged the potential of the collaboration, I think. And Chris, do you want to say a bit more about the...
Yes, so we were also able to apply for some additional internal funding from Pennine Care to fund some further knowledge exchange, which really helped us kind of accelerate the work and move the projects that we've mentioned in the previous slides forward together. So that was enormously helpful as well. Back to you, Jess.
Yeah, and we found the flexibility of the SSIA was actually like really, really useful, and also the support from the team was fantastic too in terms of thinking about things like impact and how we could like realise, the potential impact of some of the work we were doing. So what we've kind of gone on to do is that we have subsequent to the residency, has developed a therapy for young people experiencing paranoia, as we've said through the grant, but also outside of that, we're now working with young people and doing some of the feasibility and pilot testing of the intervention. Over to you, Chris.
Great, and yes, with having spent that time developing this theoretical model, there's a number of areas we can test the model to see how much our hypotheses, are supported or not. So we've been hoping to do that through other future grant applications, and to think a bit more about improving the methods for how we detect and measure paranoia in adolescents and young people early, before their experiences escalate to a point where they might meet criteria for a at-risk mental state. The ultra-high risk group that we offer support to in early intervention, NHS first episode services, or things are further along as well. So some other work to help move the field forward.
Yeah, so I guess a big thank you to the residency from us for all the things we were able to work on. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you, both Jess and Chris, for sharing this project. It's so interesting to hear more about the clinical work you're doing together, and to learn more about the benefit that it's bringing to young people that you're working with. I know I am slightly biased, also working at Royal Holloway and kind of supporting you too, but I just want to say congratulations once again on everything you've achieved. It's really, really impressive. So I will now hand over to Dr. Margaret Vogelsang for our third and final project spotlight.
Thank you so much. So, hi everyone. I'm presenting work I did in collaboration with Autism Northeast, which is a social enterprise in, obviously, the northeast of England, who support individuals with autism and who provided not only really useful clinical advice, but also provided us with connections to clinicians that we need in the research field to be able to make some real impact. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the reasoning behind our project was that we don't really know how autistic traits surface in individuals who speak multiple languages. I'm calling this multilingualism. That is an oversimplification, but just bear with me, please. The reasoning behind this, and I have these three points here, is that we know very little about how multilingualism, speaking multiple languages, speaking two languages, bilingualism, how this affects social traits specifically in autism spectrum disorder, but also other traits in autism spectrum disorder. Even though besides the prevalence of autism, actually, there's a very, very high prevalence of multilingualism in the world. Depending on how you define it, I would argue that over 50%, maybe even up to 70, 80% of the population of the world speaks multiple languages. Nevertheless, a lot of our knowledge based on research, but also a lot of our clinical practices are targeted or towards or based on monolinguals, people who speak only one language. And through my conversations with Autism Northeast, and I'm at that second point now, we realized that we both really had the intuition and they had the clinical experience as well to suggest that individuals who speak multiple languages and are exposed to multiple cultures, they might behave differently socially. And a very concrete example of a very concrete cultural example might be that in some cultures you wouldn't necessarily look someone you don't know very well in the eyes, whereas that is in that case not an indication of autism. It's a cultural element. Okay, it's a cultural behavior. And similarly with people who speak multiple languages and are exposed to multiple cultures, they might interact differently socially in multiple different ways. And we also know from other research evidence that people who do speak multiple languages and have autism, that they have improved cognitive abilities very often. But we don't really know anything about social traits just yet, at least not in a sort of formalized manner. So we had all of these intuitions, but it had never been put together into a project. So what we did was we essentially developed a questionnaire that we distributed to adults with autism and also without autism, multilingual adults, but also monolingual adults, to really tap into what happens when you speak multiple languages and you are autistic. Next slide, please. Right. And one of our main outcomes was the flyer that you can see on the right. Now, I do apologize if it is a tad small. That is just due to the size of the screen. It was originally an A4 flyer. But what we list there is not only our findings. Namely, we found that people who speak multiple languages actually display fewer social interaction traits typically associated with autism, but also what the impact is for both clinicians and the general population. Okay, and this is very important because these are very different consequences, let's say. For individuals with autism and the general population, there is a feeling of being taken seriously, of being understood. And we found that if they are multilingual, they might actually show fewer traits. So this might actually improve their quality of life, their social behaviors, their enjoyment in social interactions. So these are all objectively quite positive outcomes. But from a clinical perspective, there is a slight caveat there that I just wanted to emphasize, because these people show similar traits. So they still do have autism, okay? And they show similar traits in other subfields of autism. So sensory sensitivity, for example, communicative difficulties, repetitive behaviors, these are not affected by being multilingual. Which means that if we use tests that sort of lead to an overall average score, that these individuals who are multilingual and just score much lower on social interaction traits, they might miss out on a diagnosis, even though they definitely should still be diagnosed in order to get the support that they need. So there's a very positive story here of actually people being able to interact socially more easily, but also a cautionary tale. Okay, if you could just click one more time, I have some outcomes here. Yes, so the way we distributed this was through Autism Northeast, but also through our own social media channels. And what's great about that is that you get some testimonials from respondents. So these were unelicited. But for example, the first person says, I have not a multilingual autistic son, and I can tell you this is the case 100%. And the second individual says, I always assumed that this was applied to everyone and was not specific to my being autistic. So this real sort of increase in awareness and people feeling like they're better understood, which I think was one of the main aims of our project. If you could go to the next slide, please. Now, I was asked to say something about the lessons learned from this. I think the project and the funding really allowed us to have a very fruitful collaboration. I think this is really essential because as a research institution, we do things too often without taking both the patient and the clinician's perspective into account. And this project allowed us to do both. Which also helped us to increase the accessibility of the research for autistic individuals because both people with neurodevelopmental disorders and clinicians were involved in development of the materials. And we also learned a lot about how to make results accessible to the general population. But what we found difficult in this project, because it is about raising awareness and how do you measure awareness raised, right? So what we did have some difficulties with was defining what a measurable impact is and how to actually measure it. So the nice thing about distributing things on social media that we can see how many interactions there were with the flyers, for example. So it's about 10,000 interactions with the flyer. But besides that, I've had a lot of sort of people come up to me informally when I've shared this project with very positive responses, but I don't want to sort of start following them around to haggle them for like a testimonial, right? So I think there's a lot of positive impact made, but not all of it is measurable. So I just wanted to put that out there. One of the other issues that we had, because our data collection was done online and the distribution of our results was also done online, which is online, it's a very powerful tool in a way, but it did lead to some unreliable data as well. So it would be good as one of the next steps to maybe go into the field and interact with individuals with autism directly, for example, through interviews or something like that. Okay, the final slide, please. Thank you so much. Okay, so overall, I think we made a really positive impact that wouldn't have been possible without this funding. And what is most important for me is that several individuals came up to me that said they now feel represented in research. Due to being autistic, but also due to being multilingual. We have lots of future plans for this project because as with any good project, there are more questions that came up than answers that were provided. And it would be really, really great in the future to find some funding to develop a training course for clinicians and potentially alongside that, a more general awareness training for the general public. However, we're also in parallel working from the scientific side on replicating our initial findings, because I do think it's important that we replicate these findings with other and potentially even more diverse populations, for example, not only from England, not only from the UK, not only from the northeast of England, but seeing whether these types of effects that we found hold globally or for specific subpopulations. And from a scientific perspective, I would also really like to know what is driving these effects, right? Why does interacting with multiple people and multiple languages on, let's say, a daily basis, why does that make you more comfortable in social situations, and does it increase your enjoyment in social situations? It could be a direct effect, but it could also be due to sort of underlying explanatory variables such as cognitive abilities or self-confidence. And this is something we're looking into further at the moment with student projects. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, for sharing this project. It feels like we're hearing a lot in the news and on social media about like an increase in numbers of people being diagnosed with and a growing need for diagnosis of autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So it's such interesting work and something that seems really topical at the moment too. So thank you for sharing. So we have a little bit of time for some questions now. So I've seen a couple of questions in the chat. So I don't know, Ellie, if you're able to read a couple of them out for me, or if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to unmute and raise any.
Yeah, sure. I'll read some out. So first one from Kira is for Nichola. It is about how easy it would be to widen Autism in the Air to the rest of the UK. What would it take? So increasing the reach of the work.
Yeah, what you need is you need an airport, so you need to make contact with someone in a regional airport. And what I would suggest, rather than going for one of the bigger hubs, go for one of the smaller more local airports to begin with because it's more manageable. The staff are more willing to engage as well. I couldn't imagine sort of Heathrow, having flown through Heathrow last week, I couldn't imagine starting out Autism in the Air there. So start making the contacts initially with an airport to see if they'd be willing. You can go on to the George Best Belfast City Airport website. We've also made YouTube videos and you can show if you make that contact of what can be done. I'm happy to discuss the initial stages of what we need to do. My background is a behaviour analyst, so and I worked in the clinical field for 16 years with autistic children and their families. So the goal was that when they came to the airport, me as a behaviour analyst would be there to sort of make assessments on any behaviour issues to help sort of bring that behaviour down to de-escalate before it maybe got to the stage where they had to leave the airport. So it's having an understanding of an autism diagnosis and staff training. So we've done a lot of staff training so that they can recognise issues that are coming. So they've now put into place where you can bypass the shop and things. You can request it. And most people now they have the sunflower lanyard. So staff are trained to identify what that is. And what a lot of people don't know is that when the special assistance that you request at airports, a lot of people, when you tick that box, if you're booking a flight, they think it's really purely for mobility. It's not, it's also for neurodiverse individuals too. So that will flag to the airport staff that someone in the party needs support. So it's just about making that awareness there too. But your first contact will be finding someone in the airport who's willing to have a meeting with you and just be relentless. That's what I did. I just kept emailing and saying this was a need here and things like that there until I eventually got a meeting with the CEO and everything snowballed from that.
Thanks, Nichola. Following on from that, actually, I have a question about how you sold it to them. Did you sell it to them as part of their kind of EDI, corporate social responsibility, or did you sort of sell it as more people on flights is more money for you guys?
No, we actually sold it as a social need more than anything. We were saying that, from personal experience and like professional experience, sorry, that I could see that there was a great need for this type of support for families, particularly in Northern Ireland. We have one of the highest rates of diagnosis of autism in the whole of Europe as well. For some reason, they're looking to see why that's the case. And I was explaining that, that families should not be sort of nearly discriminated against because there's not that actual support in place. And it also helped that the CEO at the time had a family member with a disability, so was more willing to engage with us too. But as it has developed, we're now, for when I went to propose having the PhD student involved, this is where the EDI targets came into place too. So rather than just saying there was a need for it, we did say that. But for the new CEO that was in place now, he wanted more of a focus on the EDI targets for the airport and for their funders and things like that.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Second question in the chat is to Jess and Chris. It's about if you had additional time for the IAA project, maybe let's say 6 to 12 months? Is there anything else that you would have liked to prioritise that you weren't able to fit in the initial project?
Thanks so much for the question. Perhaps I'll give you the top thing I would have liked to have done, and then maybe Chris, you probably got some things you would have liked to have done too. For me, like a big thing to work out is how best to assess paranoia in this age group, because lots of things to do with the social world can make these types of worries just very normal. And I mean, these types of worries are quite normal anyway. But I think just telling the difference between, is this something that's problematic, or is this something that's okay and it's gonna, resolve at its own time. So I think how we assess and measure is really important, and is really kind of an area that needs some growth. So I guess what I would have loved to have done is work more with the PPI group, but happily we have a PPI group, and we still have the collaborators from the residency as our PPI consultants. So I think it's about coming to think about how do we improve how we measure these types of worries in this age group. And I would have loved to have do a co-production piece of work for 6 months, just really understanding and thinking about that better. Thanks for the question. Chris, how about you?
So it's probably similar, but maybe a bit more informed from my experience working in NHS services and with young people who have some of these very early signs that we call an at-risk mental state, or being ultra high risk for developing these difficulties. We know they don't develop overnight, that people have a kind of trajectory where things get more problematic for them. There's sometimes a drop in their functioning and social things that they're able to do. So perhaps being able to work with a group of young people who had that experience of being high risk, and thinking with them about what was some of the sort of things they first noticed about that transition towards having suspicious thoughts and paranoid thoughts, because I think that would really help us with thinking how we best approach people in the school settings, or things that perhaps we could target in the therapy as well. So thanks for the question as well.
Thank you both. So there's 2 questions actually for Margaret in the chat. So the first one, if I scroll up, is thinking about the legacy of the project. Do you have an idea of where you would like to have what the training published, or who would you would use to create it, to create the best impact? And the second question for Margaret is, have you used your partner networks to disseminate the outputs, or do you have plans for engaging with other partners?
Yes, thank you so much for these questions, and luckily I think I can answer them sort of 2 in 1, because I think the second one sort of answers the first one. So where the training would be published, well, initially, rather than publication, I think we would actually like to do the training, to give the training. Starting with Autism Northeast, obviously, because that is our primary partner, but in the end, then offering it as well to other partners. Now, I have had some difficulty, as you can probably hear, I'm not originally from the UK, and I have had some difficulties finding suitable project partners. So I'm hoping that once we have materials in place and have had, let's say, a successful pilot within Autism Northeast, that we can then make it available to, let's say, a wider group of potential partners to attract some interest there. So in that way, I'm taking a lot of inspiration from the example about flights, where they ran essentially from what I'm hearing, a greatly successful pilot, and now interest is actively coming to them to the extent that they can barely manage it. But I think we would need a sort of a successful prototype first, and then be able to offer it to a wider range of partners, including hopefully in the end the NHS.
Thanks, Margaret. There's a couple of questions generally to all speakers, so feel free to jump in. It's basically advice for new applicants. So if an applicant was new to Impact or new to an IAA project, what would you advise them to do in the first month, maybe? And then also, if they were newer to Impact, do you have any general advice for them? Can be a tricky question.
Am I allowed to provide my 2 cents to this as an IA manager? So I think whilst everyone else has a bit of a think about whether they have any specific guidance, I would say always sort of, if you've got an IAA and you have an IAA manager or someone who deals with impact at your university, I would say engage them early, talk to them before you submit your application, have a discussion about how best to craft your application. And I think in month one, I think it's very different depending on the university you go to, what kind of policies and processes you need to follow. But generally, I think having a really clear link between the objectives that you want to measure, the measures through which you're going to assess, are you successful at achieving your objectives, and then sort of connecting your impact evaluation strategies back through to your objectives and things like that. I think if you have a really clear understanding of that sort of impact pathway, it sounds cliche, but I think the rest will really fall into place. So having that strong foundation, I would say, actually is the best place to start.
If no one has anything on that, there is another question. I wondered if Nichola has plans to commercialise her research, possibly to establish a social venture or CIC.
Yes, that's the plan. We're working, as I say, once the CAST award is over with our PhD student, we're looking to see what we can do further and commercialise it. I think the airport are very keen to commercialise it too, so it's going to be a joint venture. And for many years, there was very little involvement. You know, the airport, they give us one of their staff to help in the evening. But now, since the IAA grant and with all the materials and the publicity we got, the airport are heavily invested in making this a success. So yeah, they're wanting to commercialise it alongside with myself.
Thanks, Nichola. That's it for questions in the chat for the moment.
Nice. Thank you, Ellie. So if there are no more questions, then I'll just wrap up and finish with some thank yous. I think Alice also mentioned that she might put a feedback form in the chat. So if people who are on the call could take a little bit of time to complete that, it would be great. It just helps us sort of improve things for next time round. First of all, thank you to all our wonderful speakers for sharing their projects. It's so nice to be able to take time to celebrate the learnings and impact that has come from this work. Thank you to Ellie and Kira for their support with this event, and to Alice for organising and providing such a lovely introduction to the IAAs. And to ESRC colleagues more generally, if anyone else is on the call, thank you for making events and projects like this possible through IAA funding. So just to wrap up, thank you to everyone really for attending. I hope you have a wonderful spring break, and I will stop the recording.